First of all, right from the start, I'd like to highlight that the work I'm going to present is a collection of papers that I've been working on with a whole series of colleagues, many of them whom are part of the centre. So I've got a fairly ambitious title to try and discuss whether coral bleaching will lead to coral reef fisheries collapse or decline. So we all know, and from a whole series of talks so far today, that coral bleaching is expected to become more frequent and more severe and more spatially extensive. And following a bleaching event, a severe bleaching event, a reef can stay in a very low coral cover state for extended periods of time, and if that occurs, the three-dimensional structure of the reef may erode, and you'll end up with these rubble banks or macroalgal fields, which is a landscape that's pretty inhospitable to fish. So the two questions I'm going to ask, the first one is just a really brief overview of what happens to fish assemblages in general after these events, and secondly, which is what I'll spend most of my time concentrating on, is what are the implications for coral reef associated fisheries. So first up, this is a meta-analysis we conducted of the short-term impacts of disturbance on fish. Along the x-axis, we have the different species of fish that we were able to collect data from 3 or more publications in the literature. And on the y-axis, we have the change in the abundance of the fish species divided by the change in coral cover. So if we start putting the different fish groups on, we see that the corallivores, or the fish that feed upon coral, consistently show declines, and where the species names are highlighted in black, in those cases all the studies were in agreement, so the 95% confidence intervals didn't intersect with 0. The coral dwelling fish also all declined, as you may expect. The epilithic algal matrix feeders, or the herbivores, were very variable, but many of them do show an increase in abundance following these bleaching events, presumably in response to the increase in algal resources. The invertebrate feeders, again, very varied, and many of these species that are showing severe declines that you may not expect to are likely, it's likely that they settle into the coral itself, so that's one of the main reasons that's probably occurring. And the planktivores, again, are very variable. We then, using the same data set, broke up the disturbances into biological, which were disturbances where the live coral tissue was lost but the skeleton would remain intact, and structural disturbances such as storms, where you lose coral cover and the structural matrix of the reef collapses in the same disturbance. And you can see for those same 5 functional groups of fish, the declines associated with structural disturbances are generally larger than for biological disturbances, and in some cases where we didn't see significant declines for just loss of coral cover, we did when the structure was lost. And this was an indication to us at the time that the long-term impacts of bleaching events were likely to be far more severe to fish, and that they would probably impact a wider range of fish, including potentially those that are harvested in fisheries. So in a later review published in UNBAR, we actually drew this out conceptually from the information we knew so far, and we had the time since bleaching along the x-axis and the proportional change on the y-axis. In the top panel, you can see if you have a rapid decline in coral cover, which, and important in this model is that the coral cover then doesn't recover, you can have an increase in algal cover, which will likely stabilize, and there'll be a lagged loss in the topographic complexity, so the structural, three-dimensional structure of the reef is likely to erode and collapse further down the line. The impacts this has on the fish, the coral-dependent fish, the fish that feed, settle, or dwell in coral itself, tend to decline fairly rapidly. The herbivores may increase in the short term, associated with that increase in algal resources, faster growth, better survival, but in the long term, with a loss of complexity, there may be declines in the herbivores, and the habitat-associated fish, so the fish that are associated with the structure of the reef itself, may decline as well. So what are the implications of this for fishery target species? Well, first of all, I want to show you two plots of the proportional composition of typical coral reef fisheries around the world. This plot is from data from Papua New Guinea and Kenya, and from the total composition of the catch, we divided the species and the individuals in the catch by whether they were fish that were dependent on live coral, fish that were dependent on the habitat matrix itself, and species that were reef associated but weren't necessarily reliant on the coral or the structure itself. And as you can see, a very small proportion of the catch are species that are dependent on live coral, as you'd expect, because corallivores tend to be quite small animals. However, the overwhelming proportion of the catch, both in terms of species and individuals, were animals that tend to rely on the physical matrix, the structure of the reef itself, which is an indication that in the long-term effects of degradation of reef systems, you may start seeing impacts on these fishery species. The second plot is data from all of the Pacific Island nations, and it's just a very simple plot showing the proportional catch by different families. And what I want you to take from this is that if you put these families into very crude feeding groups, the three feeding groups that tend to be dominant in the catches are the piscivores, the invertebrate feeders, and the herbivores. So they're the three groups that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail with in two case studies. The first one from Seychelles and the second from Fiji. So the inner Seychelles suffered extremely badly in the 1998 bleaching event. The El Nino lined up with the warm portion of the Indian Ocean dipole, and the inner Seychelles lost over 90% of their coral cover in that 1 year and have shown very, very slow recovery since then. We had data from 21 sites across the Inner Islands from 1994 with very high replication within, and we've repeated those surveys in 2005 and 2008. And in conjunction with collaborators at the Seychelles Fishing Authority, we were actually able to use their catch statistics to estimate the size at first capture of the dominant trap fishery, which targets the reef-associated fish in the islands. And we calculated that 95% of fish retained in these traps had a body depth above 6 centimetres. So fish with a body depth below 6 centimetres could squeeze out through the mesh. And using body depth length ratios, we could then filter our underwater visual census data to only include species that were available to the fishermen. And in that way, we could look at the biomass of fish that were available to the fishermen prior to the bleaching event and then these two time periods afterwards. So starting with the herbivores, if we look at the biomass above first capture, from our UVC data, the blue bars are the fished areas in the Seychelles, and the green bars are the protected areas. And you can see very little trend through time for these herbivores, but the protected areas did have a higher biomass than the fished areas. For the invertebrate feeding species, we found a fairly similar trend, although there was quite an increase in 2008 in the fished areas. And again, the protected areas were serving their purpose and increasing the biomass within their boundaries. And finally, the piscivores turned out to show us the most interesting result at size above first capture. There's absolutely no trend going on in the fished areas, but in the protected area, we've seen very substantial and continuing declines in the biomass of these fish. And bear in mind that in the inner Seychelles, the no-take areas we looked at are well complied with, they're very successful, so that decline is very unlikely to be anything to do with fishing, so it's likely to be an ecological process. Next, we put our data below first capture back in to the melting pot, and we wanted to look at what the change that was occurring in individual size classes. So here we have the individual 5 centimetre size classes along the x-axis, and we have the change in log abundance on the y-axis. So the line at 0 is your 1994 baseline before the bleaching event, and the 2 bars are the subsequent years following the bleaching event. What jumps out is that there's been a substantial increase in the abundance of medium to large-bodied animals, again likely in the case of herbivores to do with the increase in algal resources. But what you find, and again particularly in the protected area, is that you tend to have quite substantial declines in medium to small-bodied individuals and animals. And these are not insignificant, bear in mind it's a log scale. So that's quite a worrying trend in the case that as those larger individuals are fished out from the system or die of natural mortality, there's fewer and fewer individuals making it through the ranks to replace them. If we look at the invertebrate feeding fish, there's no discernible pattern going on here. There's quite a lot of noise, but there's no discernible pattern going on in any particular bracket of size class. And when we move on to the piscivores, as we saw from the size above first capture, there's nothing really happening with the fished areas, but the protected areas we've seen very substantial declines, particularly in these medium-sized classes. So there's been this huge decline in the piscivores in the inner Seychelles in the protected areas, and the most plausible reason for that that we can come up with is that it's associated with the loss of their prey. So in these protected areas, where that were dominated by branching acroporas and lost a lot of their three-dimensional structure, we've actually seen an 86% decline in the abundance of small prey fish, and that's fish below 15 centimetres maximum size, so which is probably the target size that most of these reef-associated piscivores are going for. So we think that this decline, huge decline in the piscivores, is a predator-prey mediated effect. Next, if we move to the Lau Islands in Fiji, we studied 5 islands in this group. We had 3 sites in each island and replication within, and we had those data from 2000 and we repeated them in 2006. Between 2000 and 2002, a lot of coral was lost and the habitat was degraded through a combination of coral bleaching and crown of thorns starfish outbreak. And the other thing to note from this particular study was because there's discrete ownership over the marine resources in Fiji, we could actually calculate the fishing pressure on each island very accurately. So we could use that to look at the bottom-up effects of habitat degradation compared to the top-down effects of exploitation. So in a way we could try and understand what pressures they were exerting on the fish assemblage. And we did this using path analysis or structural equation modelling. This is a fairly intuitive statistical method where you can actually come up with, using current theory and knowledge, with the most obvious or sensible paths to the response. So if the response was corallivores, coral-feeding fish, one of the most obvious paths would be path C, which is fluctuations in the cover of coral and how that would influence the abundance of corallivores. Conversely, if it was piscivores, then path I would be an obvious one, the direct impacts of fishing on their abundance, and then paths F, G, and H would make sense, where changes in coral impacting the rugosity of the reef may cause changes in their prey and have secondary effects on the piscivores. So you can come up with ecological pathways and theories and test the evidence for them. So we start by looking at the roving herbivores. The strongest weight of evidence that we found was a habitat-mediated pathway rather than a fishing-mediated pathway, whereby changes in or reduction in the coral had led to a reduction in the topographic complexity of the reef, and in turn was affecting the abundance of the herbivores. For the invertebrate feeders, we found results to support what we found in the Seychelles, that there wasn't any evidence for changes in the habitat impacting these guys, but we did find a strong relationship with exploitation. And for the piscivores, this was the again, the most unexpected result, but again supported what we found in the Seychelles, was that a habitat-mediated pathway through coral to rugosity and prey fish was explaining the variation in these piscivores more than fishing was, which was quite a surprise to us. So from that part of, from those two case studies, the invertebrate feeding fish species or fishery target species appear to be the most robust to habitat changes. The herbivores may benefit in the short term, but I think there's long-term processes. In both cases, we found evidence that changes in the habitat were influencing the herbivores, and there's likely to be lag effects that might lead to subsequent declines in their biomass. And the piscivores appear to be vulnerable to fluctuations in their prey. And what was interesting from the study in Fiji is that it's obvious that fish assemblages are increasingly being impacted from the bottom up through habitat-mediated changes and through the top-down impacts of exploitation, essentially squeezing them, if you like. So what do we do about all this? First point I'd like to make is that not all habitats are as prone to structural collapse as others. So the fringing reefs along land masses and islands such as the Seychelles tend to have coral assemblages that are quite prone to physical collapse and might collapse after as little as 4 or 5 years. Whereas wave-exposed reef fronts, particularly on atolls and exposed islands, tend to have a lot of the structure of the reef that is used by the fish is actually made up of the underlying physical matrix of the reef rather than the existing coral veneer. And I think that's an important point that we need to try and tease apart. And that will even occur within reefs and islands, I believe, where reef fronts on the exposed sides of islands will tend to have a more robust structure and so potentially maintain their fishery species compared to the back reef and more sheltered sides of the islands. The second point I want to make is that fisher adaptation is possible and is extremely likely in various ways. In some countries, fishers may reduce their reliance on the resource and move to alternate sources of income. In many situations, that is impossible. But in those cases, the fishers may move where they fish, they may target different species, or they might change their fishing gears. And Josh Sin is going to talk a lot more about some of these ideas in his talk tomorrow. The third thing is, and we've heard a bit about this today, but it's, what I've been presenting to you is the worst case scenario where you have severe bleaching event and lack of recovery, loss of the three-dimensional structure, and we're on a slippery slope. However, the ability of reefs to recover between these bleaching events is really critical and is really what we all are striving for. So in this conceptual diagram, the black line represents the coral cover and the dashed blue line is the resilience. And if a large bleaching event comes along and causes a phase shift and you've lost all of that coral, if the resilience is maintained, the reef should hopefully be able to bounce back fairly rapidly and it doesn't end up in a permanent regime shift. And what's interesting in the context of this talk is that fish are implicated as being extremely important in this process, in providing a lot of the functions necessary to control algae and promote this recovery. Which brings me to the fourth point, which is associated with actual management. So no-take marine protected areas are obviously extremely important and essential in all of this. It must be noted, however, that they can't prevent the influx of warm water that causes bleaching, and the ecological processes that lead to the loss of fish appear to be happening in the protected areas as much as in the fished areas. What we don't yet understand, because we haven't had sufficient time since the 1998 bleaching event, which is where we've got the best data, is whether these protected areas will then promote faster recovery. And also larger marine protected areas, such as we have on the Great Barrier Reef, are likely to be far more successful in the face of climate change than isolated small marine protected areas that are commonplace across the rest of the Indo-Pacific. And associated with that, in most countries, the area of reef covered by no-take areas are far smaller than the extensive areas of reef that are open to exploitation. So what we need to be doing, as Ove highlighted, is reducing all the other stressors, reducing land-based pollution and sedimentation, destructive fishing and overfishing. And then a potential measure that we've been putting a bit of thought into lately is the possibility of adaptive gear-based management. Because most fisheries around the world, coral reef fisheries, are multi-species and multi-gear. And different gears catch a different composition of species. And if you break that down into functional groups, you can think of two things. One, different gears may target more of those fish that associate with the habitat structure in the corals themselves. And secondly, different gears may target more of those key species and key functional groups that are important for regeneration and recovery. So actually understanding these compositions and managing to adaptively manage these gears is a proactive way of thinking about what we do about the areas outside of the no-take areas. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.